Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that's less philosophical and way more greasy: medieval junk food. Yep, even without drive throughs, vending machines, or late night hot dog stands, people still managed to snack. And let me tell you, some of it was delicious, some of it was downright bizarre, but all of it was deeply, unmistakably medieval. Before we sink our teeth into this, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content, and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our little global community light up. Now, dim the lights, get comfy, maybe let that fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's tasty time warp. In a world where most snacks looked suspicious and tasted worse, apple fritters were a rare win. Hot, sweet, and slightly dangerous, just like most good decisions in the Middle Ages. Think of them as medieval donuts, but without frosting or food safety. What went into a fritter back then? Apples, obviously, but not your shiny grocery store kind. These were small, tart, knobbly things, probably swiped from someone else's tree, chopped up and thrown into a rough batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because water was risky and ale made everything more fun. Then came the fry. Deep frying in the 1300s, that was a full-blown event. The oil, usually pig fat, was reused so many times it probably had voting rights. It added flavor, let's say. But the end result: crispy, golden little pucks of joy, with soft centers and a minor chance of third-degree burns. If you were rich and lucky, they might be dusted with imported sugar. Flex alert. For everyone else, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup did the trick. Either way, it was sweet enough to help you forget your usual diet of cabbage doing impressions of real food. Fritters were street food. You grabbed one at a fair, after church, or on market days when you wanted a treat, and didn't care about grease stains on your tunic. Kids loved them. Adults loved them. Birds tried to steal them. They were quick, fun, and indulgent enough to make you forget about the pickled turnips waiting at home. Sure, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter had a weird chewiness. But when they were good, they were really good. One bite, and you suddenly understood why people tolerated medieval life. Now, if fritters were the medieval donut, then cheese curds, they were basically medieval popcorn. Bite-sized, slightly squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. They weren't flashy. They didn't melt. They didn't stretch. Honestly, they barely did anything. And that's what made them perfect. Medieval cheese wasn't trying to go viral. It was made quickly, eaten faster, and built to survive long journeys, bad storage, and the occasional goat stepping on it. Cheese curds were like baby cheese, the fresh bits before they matured into something hard enough to build a wall with. They were a byproduct of cheese making. Farmers separated milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds elegant until you realize it came from the stomach of a baby animal. But hey, it worked. The curds got a light press, a sprinkle of salt, and that was it. Cheese curds. Sometimes soft, sometimes rubbery. Sometimes they squeaked when you bit them, like they had opinions, but they were portable, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. And in a world where snack often meant crusty bread or cold, broth curds felt like a small victory. Monks loved them, travelers packed them, kids ate them like candy. If the cows cooperated that week, you could fry them, crumble them over stew, or just grab a handful while pretending you didn't smell like a barn. They didn't need a holiday or a feast. Cheese curds just existed, comforting, familiar, and mildly chewy. The kind of food that never stole the show, but always showed up. Reliable. The snack equivalent of your most loyal friend. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Absolutely. Freshness was more of a suggestion than a guarantee in the Middle Ages. But with enough salt and blind optimism, most folks just powered through. No refrigeration meant your standards naturally shifted. So no, cheese curds weren't glamorous, but they were simple, filling, and just indulgent enough to feel like a treat. Bonus, they were excellent for bribing cats and small children in a pinch. Now let's talk turnips. Turnips are not dessert. Let's just make peace with that. But in a world where sugar was a luxury, apples weren't always in season, and creative desperation was basically a food group. Someone somewhere looked at a turnip and thought, what if this were pie? Enter the turnip pie. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always terrible. Sometimes it was even decent. Picture mashed turnips, hopefully soft, mixed with egg, maybe sweetened with a little honey, or dried fruit if the cook was feeling fancy. Then it was baked in a crust made of flour, water, and sheer determination. The result? Surprisingly edible. At its best, warm, slightly sweet, and kind of comforting in a root vegetable meets pudding kind of way. At its worst, like someone mistook animal feed for a baking challenge and just went with it. Turnip pies thrived for two big reasons. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust could hide just about anything. Overripe? Undercooked? Bitter? Doesn't matter. Wrap it in pastry, drizzle a little honey, and boom. Peasant cuisine with high hopes. Was it cheesecake? Not even close. But it tried. And in medieval Europe, trying counted for something. You'd find these pies at fairs, on feast tables, and in monasteries where monks had more root vegetables than sense. Some recipes called for spices, nutmeg if the abbey was wealthy, pepper if the cook was feeling chaotic. Occasionally, raisins showed up. No one really knew why. Nobles didn't touch turnip pie unless they were slumming it for fun or doing a relatable peasant bit for politics. But for everyone else, it was dessert, or at least an after-meal pastry-like object. And despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie stuck around. People liked it, or at least didn't dislike it enough to stop making it. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet. In medieval terms, that made it practically groundbreaking. Now, if we're talking medieval comfort food MVPs, nothing beats the meat pasty. A handheld pie, stuffed with seasoned meat, folded into a crust, and baked until golden, or occasionally scorched. Basically, a medieval hot pocket, minus the microwave, and with added danger. The genius of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or while watching a public execution, whatever the day demanded. Wrapped in thick pastry, it stayed warm and protected the filling from dirt, rats, and rogue sneezes. Now, about that filling, meat was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or hunting estate, you might get pork, mutton, or venison, actual recognizable meat. Otherwise, things got creative. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Basically, if it had legs or moved, someone probably seasoned it and tucked it into pastry. Spices were your best friend, not so much to enhance the flavor, but more to distract from it. Cloves, pepper, and cinnamon were less about taste and more about plausible deniability. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, sure, but they couldn't fully disguise the fact that the meat had been resting a little longer than ideal. Still, in a time when lunch usually meant bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt downright luxurious. There were vegetarian versions too, stuffed with root vegetables, leeks, or cheese, typically reserved for fasting days or the more devout. But make no mistake, the meat-filled ones were the stars. Hot, greasy, and comforting. You didn't ask questions. You just ate and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. And in case you're wondering, yes, people did mark their crusts with initials or little symbols, especially among miners and laborers. In some places, the edge of the crust was made extra thick, not to eat, but to hold with dirty hands, then tossed to the spirits, or more realistically, the rats. Were they good? Often. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the charm. You didn't eat a pasty for peace of mind. You ate it because it was tasty, and you were prepared to deal with the consequences. In a world where oral hygiene meant rinsing with wine and praying for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval people had to breathe mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental gamble, all packed into one crunchy little bite. These seeds were coated in a hardened shell of sugar. No small feat when sugar had to be imported, boiled, and beaten into submission by hand. Someone, somewhere, really believed in the power of this snack. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be offered a small dish of them after dinner to freshen their breath, or, more likely, to mask the mutton still clinging to their molars. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a sharp, licorice-like bite. You either loved them or swallowed them politely and nodded like nothing happened. The sugar helped, but that herbal kick always made its presence known, a confusing mix of fancy and forest. And they weren't just for show. Candied fennel seeds were meant to help with digestion. People believed fennel calmed the stomach, especially after a meal involving multiple birds and a heroic amount of mead. Think of them as medieval chewing gum meets Tums, except with more potential to crack a tooth. And yes, they were hard. Crack your molar if you're too bold. Hard. You didn't just chew candied fennel seeds. You tested them first, nibbled carefully, listened for cracks. Then, if all seemed safe, committed. It was a bite-sized thrill ride. While the wealthy popped them like medieval Tic Tacs. The common folk got the off-brand version: honey, crushed herbs, and a lot of wishful thinking. Not quite the same, but good enough to pretend. In the grand lineup of medieval snacks, candied fennel seeds were small but mighty. They didn't fill you up, but they left your mouth tasting better and gave you the illusion of class, even if you were covered in mud and still wearing last night's goose grease. If medieval desserts had a golden child, it was the honey cake, sweet, dense, and sticky enough to bond permanently with your fingers and possibly your soul. Honey cakes were born when bakers got ambitious, but sugar was locked away in castle treasuries. Honey, however, was for the people, at least the ones brave enough to mess with bees or climb trees and risk a sting to the face. These cakes were typically made with flour, water, and honey, or what counted as a spoonful in a time when spoons were mostly used to fend off siblings. The result? A chewy slab that could be either a delightful dessert or a sturdy doorstop, depending on how long it had been sitting near the fire. If the household was feeling rich, or just wanted to show off, spices like nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon might be added. That turned your average honey cake into a gossip-worthy event. Dried fruits were thrown in too, if they hadn't already been stolen by kids or fermented into wine. Honey cakes were popular at feasts, festivals, and weddings, mainly because they could be made ahead of time, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive being dropped, stepped on, or lightly weaponized during an argument. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and subtle insults. Here, I made you this cake. It's sweet. Unlike you, they weren't delicate. Many resembled edible bricks. Cutting one required a firm hand and a prayer. Eating one was easier, as long as you didn't expect fluff. These cakes were built for medieval life, tough, dependable, and sticky enough to make you question your life choices, but still deeply satisfying. They tasted like warmth, indulgence, and the rare joy of not eating salted grain or chasing a rat out of your pantry. Now let's talk fish skin cracklings, possibly the most unexpectedly delightful snack to come out of a culinary tradition that also gave us eel pie. These crispy, salty strips weren't glamorous, but they were efficient. Waste not, want not, especially when your food smells like it's judging you. Let's be real. No one planned to invent this. Some thrifty cook probably stared at a pile of leftover fish skins and thought, what if we fried it? A splash of hot fat later, and history, or something very crunchy, was made. Fish skin was everywhere, especially in coastal towns or river villages. Herring, cod, whatever was pulled out of the water. The meat went into stew. The heads went to the cat, and the skins. They hit a hot pan and sizzled into submission. The result was unexpectedly addictive, thin, crispy, and crackling like dried leaves, but tasting like pure, concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience. Add a little garlic or herbs. Now, you were flirting with medieval culinary greatness. These fish skin cracklings weren't just tasty, they were practical, lightweight, non-perishable-ish, and packed with fat. Exactly what a hard-working medieval body needed after a day of hauling firewood or guarding sheep from someone else's sheep. Soldiers packed them, sailors lived off them, peasants sold them outside taverns for a few coins and the satisfaction of feeding drunk people something louder than their conversation. Did they still have scales sometimes? Definitely. Did they curl into weird shapes that made you question your life choices? Absolutely. But by medieval standards, they were downright elegant, crispy, flavorful, and unlikely to give you dysentery. That's a win. The only real drawback? The smell. These things could announce their presence from 3 huts away. Fry a batch indoors, and your house would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a week, but you'd be forgiven because they tasted that good. Now, when life handed you stale bread and warm beer, you didn't complain. You made one of the most medieval snacks imaginable, bread soaked in ale, known variously as soups or trench toast. This was the original comfort food. Think French toast, minus the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or happiness. Here's the recipe. Take yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as a blunt weapon, and dunk it into a bowl of ale. Not modern craft ale with a citrus finish. No, this was flat, low alcohol, homebrewed stuff with the hygiene standards of a medieval chicken coop. The bread soaked up the ale like a sponge. With trust issues, it softened, swelled, and turned from brick to something vaguely chewable. Was it tasty? Under the right lighting, in a good mood, and with low expectations? Yeah, kind of. It was warm, bready, and carried that gently bitter tang of fermented grain. In other words, it didn't offend the palate, and that was good enough. This was a working class staple. No time for cutlery, no appetite for multi-course meals. Just calories that didn't punch back. Bread soaked in ale was quick, hearty, and just messy enough to feel like a proper break from the day. People sometimes added extras, a pinch of herbs, a scrap of cheese, maybe even a fried egg if the hens were feeling generous. On feast days, you might get the upgraded version, bread soaked in spiced ale, which basically meant someone found a shaving of nutmeg and felt ambitious. Like most medieval recipes, this one pulled double duty. It filled you up and stretched. Your ingredients: bread too stale to chew? Soak it. Ale starting to go weird? Pour it on bread and call it rustic. In medieval kitchens, waste was for rookies. The downside: it didn't travel well. Once soaked, bread became a kind of soggy porridge. Cube. If you didn't eat it fast, you were left with a sad, sloshy sponge, and a 1,000-year-old metaphor for disappointment. But still, on a cold evening, huddled near the hearth, nothing beat a warm bowl of ale, bread mush, and 5 whole minutes of peace. And if you've ever looked at stale bread and thought, this would be better drowned in alcohol, well, congratulations. You and the medievals have something in common. Congratulations. You and the medieval upper class officially have something in common. Sops in wine, one of the more refined, or let's say bizarrely specific, snacks of the Middle Ages. Technically a dessert, arguably just an experience. The concept was simple. Take some bread, ideally toasted, or at least not fossilized, and dunk it in wine. But not just any wine. This was usually mulled, spiced, or sweetened wine. Something warm, fragrant, and doing its best to hide the fact that it had been aging in a clay jug since last harvest. Once soaked to a satisfying sogginess, the bread was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles called it elegant. Everyone else quietly wondered if the cook had just given up. This was not finger food. It was the kind of dish you ate slowly, with a spoon, while pretending to enjoy lute music. It showed up at banquets, late night feasts, and those awkward dinners where nobody wanted to talk politics. So instead, they passed around wine soaked toast in silence. When done right, sops in wine were warm, cozy, and mildly intoxicating, a gentle wind down to a heavy meal. The wine gave it richness, the bread added texture, and the spices made you feel like you were participating in something far classier than it actually was. Done wrong, it was just wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could save the sinking feeling that you were eating a medieval mistake. Sometimes cooks added dried fruits or nuts for flair, occasionally cheese, and once in a while, a whole egg. At that point, it wasn't a snack, it was a culinary mystery. Peasants made their own versions, often using ale or cheap vinegar instead of wine. Not dessert, just survival. It could be dinner, breakfast, or whatever meal you called, something that left you both full and confused. Still, sops and wine had staying power. They were warm, they were filling, and they gave medieval folks a moment of indulgence, even if it tasted like sponge soaked in fermented regret. Fermented regret. Now, let's talk dried fruit, the golden treasure of medieval snacks. Sugary, exotic, and shelf stable enough to survive a crusade. But let's not pretend this was your modern trail mix with resealable packaging and nutrition facts. Medieval dried fruit had one job: survive. Taste was a bonus. Texture? Brutal. Dental damage? Almost guaranteed. The staples were raisins, figs, dates, and if you were really showing off, imported prunes. These fruits were sun-dried, smoke-dried, or occasionally just forgotten on a windowsill until they officially retired from the fresh produce category, wrinkled, tough, alarmingly dense, like edible fossils from last harvest. The upside? Sweetness. Pure, concentrated medieval candy. Nobles adored them. Monks hoarded them. Kids treated them like loot. Precious little gems scavenged from the kitchen. The downside? They fought back. Figs came with seeds that moonlighted as medieval dental floss. Dates could glue your molars shut. Raisins lodged themselves in your teeth like they were planning a siege. There was no such thing as snacking discreetly. Still, dried fruit had its moments. They made their way into pies, stirred into porridge, or chopped up into honey cakes to create the illusion of variety. Sweet, chewy, and impossible to ignore. Just like half the guests at a medieval feast, rich folks had a knack for turning even the simplest snack into a performance. Dried fruit? Oh, they'd wrap it in delicate pastry, drizzle it with rose water, or soak it in wine, like they were trying to impress a diplomat from Florence. For the average medieval person, though, getting your hands on dried fruit was a genuine event. It usually meant a holiday, a wedding, or maybe just that rare day someone remembered your existence. When it did happen, you didn't just eat it, you savored it. Slowly, quietly, possibly in the barn, to avoid sharing with nosy relatives. It was the kind of snack you treated with reverence, or at least a healthy dose of selfishness. Storage was simple. Dried fruit didn't spoil easily and was often stashed in cloth sacks or clay pots. Over time, it hardened into something resembling a medieval jawbreaker. Sure, it became less of a snack and more of a weapon, but that just meant it lasted longer and doubled as sibling deterrent. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and just dangerous enough to leave a lasting impression. Sometimes, literally, a raisin stuck in your molar was basically a rite of passage. Now let's say you wake up ravenous. You want something hearty, something fried, something that might bite back. Enter the blood pudding ball, a snack so dense, so bold, so unapologetically iron rich, it makes modern sausage rolls look like timid breadsticks. Born from the noble and slightly alarming tradition of using every part of the animal, blood pudding balls were proof that in the Middle Ages, waste not wasn't just a motto, it was a survival tactic, even if what you weren't wasting was blood. Here's how it worked. Start with fresh animal blood, usually pig, but honestly, anything warm and red would do. Mix it with oats, onions, suet, that's beef fat for the uninitiated, and spices. Stir until it becomes a grim, sticky porridge. Then roll it into little balls and fry it in bubbling fat until the outside crisps up like it's got something to prove. The result? Dark, crunchy orbs of protein-packed sustenance. The taste? Rich, earthy, and unmistakably iron-forward, aka you'll be tasting blood and mystery the rest of the day. Best served hot, fresh from the pan, though some folks ate them cold if their hunger was stronger than their fear of congealed fat. Nobles might dress them up with a sprinkle of pepper or serve them alongside eggs and ale. Peasants? They were just grateful to be eating something that wasn't boiled cabbage. These weren't elegant snacks. They were gritty, calorie heavy, and alarmingly filling. 2 of them could skip you through lunch. 4, you were either a blacksmith or making questionable life choices. Blood pudding balls were common at fairs, market stalls, and roadside stands. Anywhere that smelled like livestock, ambition, and possibly regret. They were especially beloved in winter because what warms the soul quite like fried coagulation? Granted, they weren't for everyone. Some couldn't get past the texture. Others just weren't thrilled about the concept. But in a world where tastes good, ranked somewhere below, won't kill me, these dense little meatballs earned their place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. And now, forget everything you know about pancakes. Medieval pancakes weren't stacked sky high or topped with syrup and whipped cream. They were thin, tough, and fried in enough lard to make your arteries stage a protest. But they worked, and in a world where your breakfast choices were either that or a sad bowl of thin soup, thinking about its life choices, they were downright indulgent, made from flour, eggs, and a splash of water or ale for that cheerful bitter edge. These pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle, slathered in hot pig fat. No non-stick pans, no measuring cups. You just poured and prayed. The result? A flat, uneven disc with crispy browned edges and a chewy, slightly mysterious center. Sometimes burnt, sometimes undercooked, occasionally both. but always edible and surprisingly transportable. These were pancakes you could shove in your pouch, hop on a horse, and still eat 3 hours later without too many regrets. They were topped with what you had, maybe a bit of honey, a handful of herbs, or if the stars aligned, a scrap of cheese or meat. No syrup, no butter towers, just honest, lard fried resilience on a plate. Medieval pancakes weren't pretty, but they filled your belly, warmed your hands, and gave you just enough joy to get through a morning of mud, chores, and the occasional Viking scare. Flavor depended on what you had. A splash of ale added tang, a spoonful of honey, luxury, a sprinkle of herbs or some chopped onions. That was basically culinary bravery, but most of the time, medieval pancakes were just pancake and grease, served hot and inhaled like you'd just outrun a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them: peasants, nobles, monks, merchants. Some layered them with cheese, others dunked them in broth, and plenty just rolled them up and called it breakfast. Sweet, savory, or scorched beyond recognition, there was no wrong way to pancake. Leftovers, stack them up and pretend it was cake or armor. Honestly, both. They were especially popular during Lent and fasting days. When meat was forbidden, pancakes became a sacred loophole. Fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. They were also sneaky, perfect for disguising leftover ingredients that had no business in your mouth, but needed using anyway. No one ever called them beautiful, but medieval pancakes had staying power. They didn't need compliments, they just needed heat, fat, and a willing stomach. And somewhere between snack and sacrament, we meet the medieval wafer, thin, crisp, suspiciously light, like a biscuit that had undergone spiritual training. Wafers tiptoed the line between dessert and dental hazard. They were everywhere, outside churches, at village fairs, in monks' hands, and sometimes floating in soup like a holy crouton. Just to be clear, these weren't chocolate-covered, cream-filled confections. No, medieval wafers were made with flour, water, eggs, and not much else. Feeling fancy, add honey or a dash of rose water. But mostly, it was basics. A thin batter poured onto scalding hot wafer irons, then pressed flat between two metal plates, like a sacred medieval panini press. The result? A thin, crisp disc that looked like it belonged in a religious ritual and tasted like crispy parchment with ambition. Wafers were beloved for their portability, simplicity, and profitability. Vendors would set up shop outside churches on feast days, waving steaming stacks of fresh wafers at churchgoers like edible indulgence coupons. Buy now. Sin later wasn't the slogan, but it was definitely the vibe. Designs varied: religious symbols, flowers, sometimes even a saint's face, if the mold was fancy or the baker was awake. These didn't help the taste, but gave you something to stare at while pretending you weren't disappointed. Structurally, wafers were delicate. They cracked if you looked at them funny, and shattered if you looked at them seriously. Storing them was tricky. Transporting them was risky. Eating them outdoors was a game of crumbs, wind, and mild regret. Still, they were light, celebratory, and just indulgent enough to feel special. Nobles sometimes stacked them with cheese or fruit. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen and eaten quickly before they disintegrated into edible confetti. And then there was sucket. Yes, it sounds sticky, and it was. This decadent treat was essentially fruit boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sugary hostage. Think candied oranges, ginger, or dates, coated in enough sweetness to make your dentist weep and your conscience whisper, "You really don't need this, but you did it anyway." Sucket wasn't for the onion-chewing everyman. This was elite snacking, the kind served at banquets, gifted among nobility, or eaten on a random Wednesday by someone too rich for self-control. Sugar was a luxury. Fruit was seasonal. So when Sucket showed up, it meant someone was either celebrating or flexing. Preparation. Ambitious. You'd boil fruit in thick syrup, sometimes honey, sometimes actual refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you. Then you'd drain it, dry it, and repeat multiple times because once wasn't enough. This wasn't just candy, it was a declaration of war on moisture. The final result? Glossy, jewel-toned nuggets of concentrated sweetness, chewy, intense, so sugary it could probably be weaponized, but irresistible. Sucket wasn't just food, it was a status symbol, a dessert, a bribe, a tiny act of rebellion against the gray, salted monotony of everyday life. Some versions of Sucket were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars that looked more like perfume containers than dessert dishes. Others were dried, rolled in sugar, and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hypoglycemia, tiny bites of sweetness with the power to launch a cavity. But don't be fooled. Sucket was more than a treat. It was a status symbol. It said, "I have sugar." It said, "I know a guy with trade connections." It said, "I employ someone whose entire job is to stir a pot for hours without losing their mind." Sucket trays made the rounds at banquets like edible treasure. Guests would politely take one, smile graciously, and immediately regret not pocketing a few more. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen, maybe licked the spoon, maybe not. Depends who was looking. Was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Sucket was one of the rare medieval snacks that felt like an actual dessert. Rich, refined, just decadent enough to make you forget that dinner had included something boiled, gray, and unidentifiable. And now, the grand finale of medieval junk food, fried eel, a dish so strangely beloved, it slithered from humble hearths to royal banquets without ever asking the obvious question, am I really the best option here? Apparently, yes. Eel was everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams teemed with them. They were cheap, abundant, and easy to catch. When fried, surprisingly crispy. Sure, raw eel was slippery, bonier than expected, and shaped like the antagonist in a fish-themed horror story. But people still ate it by the bucket load. Why? Because it was tasty. And more importantly, it wasn't turnips. The process started with catching them, usually at night when they slithered through shallow, waters like sentient noodles. Then came the skinning, which wasn't so much cooking prep as it was medieval mortal combat. Skinning an eel was like wrestling a wet rope with commitment issues. Once subdued, the eel was chopped, maybe seasoned if you were feeling bold, then tossed into sizzling fat until the skin crisped up and the flesh turned firm and savory. The end result? Crunchy on the outside, tender inside, and rich with flavor. A kind of unholy hybrid between calamari and chicken, if both had been cooked in a chaotic tavern and dared for each other to be bolder. Fried eel showed up everywhere, at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, even religious fasts. That's right, eel wasn't technically meat. It slipped through dietary loopholes like, well, itself. Monks ate it, nobles flaunted it, kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquet tables like the sea serpent it always wanted to be. Sure, it had bones, a lot of them, and yes, it occasionally twitched after death, which added drama and trauma in equal measure. But if you could get past the texture, the appearance, and the creeping sense that you were eating a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy skin, rich, oily flavor, and just greasy enough to make you feel like you were doing something mildly rebellious. A slippery little miracle that kept bellies full, menus weird, and medieval cuisine wildly unpredictable. In my homeland, ancient Mesopotamia, dreams were never just idle thoughts. They weren't personal, they weren't private, they were divine telegrams sent straight from the gods to your sleeping mind. To ignore one? Well, that's like leaving a message from Enlil unread. Dangerous, disrespectful, possibly fatal. I've spent my life among the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Every one of them believed the gods spoke in symbols, in whispers, in dreams. And by around 2500 BCE, we had already carved those whispers into clay tablets written in cuneiform. These weren't bedtime stories. They were tools of governance and survival. I've seen kings delay entire wars because of a bad dream. I've seen farmers skip planting season because they dreamt of a flying goat. You laugh, but in our world, that was serious business. The gods were always speaking. It was your duty to listen, with your eyes closed. That's where we came in. Baru priests, dream interpreters, the closest thing you'll find to a divine translator. I trained in temples filled with omen texts, like the legendary Ishkar Sak Aku, our dream manual. It lists every vision, every symbol, and what it means. Dreaming of eating dates, that's a blessing. Losing your teeth, death in the family. And if you dream of sleeping with a goddess, congratulations. You're either highly favored or painfully arrogant. These weren't guesses. They were equations. Divine algebra. A equals B. Snake. Betrayal. Falling from a rooftop? A lawsuit is coming. The world of dreams wasn't random. It followed rules. God's rules. Which, yes, often defied human logic, but never their own. And we didn't just interpret, sometimes we invited the dreams. If a ruler needed guidance, he wouldn't consult a council. He'd sleep in the temple, under strict rituals, fasting, cleansing, offerings of incense, all in the hope that a divine message would find him by morning. That was called dream incubation, a sacred art. Not everyone succeeded. Sometimes you saw a fish juggling fire. Other times, a god might whisper a secret so clear it changed the fate of kingdoms. What I've learned is this: the gods never truly sleep. They speak in layers, in riddles, in visions you only understand once you're fully awake. My work, our work, is to decode the divine. And trust me, the gods are still speaking. Whether or not you choose to listen is up to you. Now, I've walked many temple courtyards in my time, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: not all dreams are created equal, and not all places are made for hearing the gods clearly. We Mesopotamians understood that certain environments, holy spaces, quiet sanctuaries, chambers lined with sacred inscriptions, amplified the divine signal. The gods didn't want to shout. They wanted you to listen carefully, in a place free from distractions, and preferably free from dreams about drunk goats. To us, the dream world wasn't something to solve. It was something to navigate with reverence, caution, and a large enough clay tablet library to make a scholar weep. We believed the gods spoke constantly. You just had to be asleep to hear them. But we weren't the only ones tuning in. Just down the river of time, in ancient Egypt, dreams held a different but equally sacred role. The Egyptians didn't see dreams as riddles. They saw them as moving sacred texts, floating between this world and the next. A dream could carry the voice of a god, the advice of an ancestor, or even a message from one's own Ka, the spiritual twin that shadowed every soul. And every dream had a purpose. It could warn, bless, instruct, or scare you out of your linen sheets. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had begun documenting their dreams with the same seriousness we used for treaties and temple records. They wrote them not in cuneiform, but in ink on papyrus, delicate as a breath but powerful as divine law. One of their most famous compilations comes from the village of Deir el Medina, the Ramesside Dream Book. I've seen a copy, or at least what survives. It's not a bedtime scroll, it's a diagnostic tool filled with hundreds of dreams, each one classified, categorized, and either blessed or doomed. Dream of drinking warm beer in the sun, good fortune. Dream of fighting a crocodile, might want to update your will. Like us, they believed dreams followed rules, not always human rules, but patterns set by forces older and deeper than any mortal kingdom. While we consulted clay tablets and trained in the omen schools of Babylon, Egyptian priests consulted inked scrolls and whispered prayers to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Different gods, different methods, same truth. Dreams were never just dreams. They were spiritual messages, portals, warnings, gifts. And if you were wise, you paid attention, even if the dream came wrapped in feathers and nonsense. Now I'll admit, some of the Egyptians' dream interpretations would have left even a seasoned Babylonian like me scratching his beard. Take this one. If a man sees himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, it means he'll become a high official. Strange? Absolutely. But within their cosmology, it made a twisted sort of sense. The crocodile, after all, was sacred to Sobek, their god of strength, ferocity, and power. So, to eat a crocodile in a dream wasn't an act of horror, it was a symbol of divine absorption. You weren't devouring an animal, you were inheriting its sacred power, a promotion in symbolic form. That's how their dream manuals worked, especially the famous Ramesside Dream Book. Each entry started with the phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by a vivid dream scenario. These weren't random ideas. They came from centuries of ritual observation, temple tradition, and lived visions. And just like we recorded omens in clay, they used red and black ink to sort dreams into two fates, favorable or disastrous. Red, you might want to pray. Black, you could breathe. For now, if your dream was listed under the bad column, it wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. Time to light incense, purify yourself, and seek out a temple priest, preferably one who had the god Thoth's attention that week. Dream interpretation in Egypt wasn't theater, it was healthcare, prophecy, and theology bundled into one night's sleep. In fact, their temples even practiced dream incubation, much like we did. I respected that. Supplicants, especially the sick, would undergo rituals of purification and prayer, then sleep within the temple, often near the altars of healing deities like Serket or Thoth. The hope? That in their dreams, the gods would deliver a cure, a command, or a vision. And it worked, at least for those wise enough to listen and wealthy enough to buy good incense. But Egyptian dream logic extended even further. Recurring nightmares? Prescribe an amulet. Ominous visions? Perform a ritual to erase the dream, just as one might erase a curse. To them, the sleeping mind wasn't a passive space. It was a living stage where gods, demons, ancestors, and even the dead could perform messages if you had the courage to watch and the wisdom or priest to understand. Different lands, different gods, but the truth remains. The divine doesn't just speak by day, it whispers through the dark, and dreams are the language it uses. Now the Greeks. The Greeks. Philosophers in daylight, mystics in moonlight. If you think we Mesopotamians took dreams seriously, let me tell you, the Greeks made dreaming a full-time ritual. In their world, a dream wasn't just a whisper from the gods. It was a clinical appointment, a healing session with divine intent. And no god was more famous for this practice than Asclepios, their god of medicine and holy dreams. The Greeks built Asclepia, healing temples that stretched from Epidaurus to Pergamon. I've heard tales from travelers who visited. They say these sanctuaries weren't filled with physicians, but with priests of sleep, the sick, the suffering, the hopeful. They came not for potions, but for incubation, the sacred act of sleeping inside a temple, hoping to receive a dream from Asclepios himself. And this was no casual nap. Before you were allowed to rest inside the Abaton, the temple's sacred sleeping chamber, you had to be purified, bathing, fasting, sometimes even sacrificing an animal to prove your sincerity. Only then could you lay on the cold stone bed and wait for the god to visit you in a dream. And when he did, oh, the visions were potent. Some dreamers reported Asclepios touching them with his staff. Others dreamed of sacred snakes slithering gently over their bodies, his holy symbol. Many woke, claiming they were healed. Others said they were given divine instructions. What herb to gather, what behavior to change, what sacrifice to offer. Were the dreams real? Induced? Imagined? Who's to say? But the impact, very real. Even Hippocrates, the father of Greek medicine, acknowledged the power of dreams in diagnosis. Unlike some modern thinkers who scoff at symbols, he understood that the body speaks in visions when the conscious mind is quiet. A dream of floodwaters could mean kidney problems. A dream of tight pressure, chest ailments. Greek physicians divided dreams into two types: natural, caused by food, stress, emotion, and divine, messages from the gods or the great unknown. And while temple priests handled sacred dreams, the streets were run by the onirokritai, the professional dream readers, scrolls in hand, omens in mind, and more confidence than most kings. These interpreters were revered and feared. The most famous among them was Artemidorus of Daldis, who wrote the Onerocritica in the 2nd century CE, a massive dream manual still studied by scholars centuries later. I read a copy once. He had flair. I'll give him that. In Greece, a dream wasn't something you forgot with the morning sun. It was a bridge between body and soul, mortal and divine, something to be honored, something to be decoded. And in their own strange way, they were right, because whether you were sleeping in Babylon, Thebes, or Athens, one truth always remains. The gods speak in silence, and if you're lucky, they speak when your eyes are closed. Illness and healing. Yes, dreams could do that. And if the gods were truly watching, you might wake with strength, return to your limbs, and perhaps a sacred snake curled peacefully at your feet. A blessing, a sign, a reminder that not all medicine comes in jars or scrolls. But beyond healing, there was one category of dream that commanded even greater reverence throughout the ancient world: the prophetic dream. These weren't just messages, they were warnings, revelations, and calls to action, visions that pierced the veil between the mortal and the divine. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, such dreams were treated as cosmic transmissions, dispatched from gods, ancestors, or fate itself. In my own city of Babylon, kings often woke trembling, scribes rushing to record their dreams before dawn stole the details. Single vision could sway a war, delay a treaty, or demand a sacrifice. If the gods sent you a dream, you acted, because ignoring it was not just foolish, it was blasphemous. The ancient Hebrews shared this conviction. In their sacred tradition, prophetic dreams weren't metaphors. They were divine communication. The Tanakh, what you might call the Old Testament, offers story after story of dreams that shifted nations. Take Joseph, son of Jacob, a mere boy when he dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing before his own. A symbol, yes, but also a premonition of power. Later, in Egypt, he interpreted Pharaoh's troubling dream: 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin ones. Joseph saw famine hiding behind the dream's curtain. His interpretation saved a kingdom and reshaped an empire's economy. He didn't just read dreams, he led with them, and we did the same. In Mesopotamia, prophetic dreams were markers of legitimacy. Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a ruler both feared and learned, once claimed the gods visited him in sleep, guiding him through conquest and counsel. His dreams weren't seen as fantasy, they were proof that his crown bore divine approval. That was the power of prophecy. It didn't whisper, it confirmed. In a world where kings stood close to the divine, dreams sealed their place in the heavens. In Greece, too, prophetic dreams crossed from temple walls to royal beds. Even Artemidorus, the famed interpreter, included dream signs tied to empire and revolt. His writings remind us that some dreams are not personal, they are historical. Prophetic dreams gave order to chaos. They offered answers when logic failed. They filled the space between what is and what will be. And if you were wise, you didn't fear them. You listened. The Greeks, ever the thinkers, understood what we in Babylon had always known. Dreams weren't all the same. They classified them in hypnea, dreams from within the body, products of the subconscious, of digestion, emotion, or fatigue. But then there were the oniroi alethinoi, true dreams, dreams that pierced the veil and brought actual revelation. Those were not dismissed. Those were revered. Those were revered. Before founding a city, declaring a war, or launching a ship across a restless sea, Greek leaders often paused, not to consult a general, but a dream, or better yet, a trained onirokrites, a dream reader with scrolls, symbols, and the ears of the gods. Dreams were sacred enough to have their own spirits, oneiroi, winged and shadowy, who slipped silently into sleeping minds, delivering messages from Olympus or beyond. The gods didn't always speak in thunder or flame. Sometimes they whispered through the soft wings of sleep. Even the Romans, pragmatic and disciplined as they were, gave dreams their due. Augustus, the first emperor, dreamt of glory before he ever touched a crown. Nero, ever insecure, kept dream interpreters in court. Though judging by his downfall, perhaps he didn't listen closely enough. And then there's Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who dreamt of victory before defeating Hannibal. A vision he claimed came from the spirits of his ancestors. And after that dream, Rome changed forever. Across ancient civilizations, prophetic dreams were not superstition, they were strategy. They were policy. They were divine correspondence in symbolic form, and those who understood them shaped history. These were not side notes. They were instruments of power. And while the temples of Asclepios in Greece are the most famous centers of dream incubation, the sacred practice of sleeping for guidance was far more widespread. In Anatolia, what you now call modern-day Turkey, the art of dream healing thrived across cultures. Hittite, Phrygian, Greek, and Roman. Temples stood on hills, beneath stars, near sacred springs, each one a threshold between sky and soil, soul and sleep. The most fascinating to me, the cult of Men, the Phrygian moon god, guardian of cycles, time, and, naturally, dreams. His temples were always high, always facing the night sky, as if angled just right to catch the moonlight and translate it into visions. To dream in his temple wasn't just sleep, it was alignment with the heavens, with healing, with unseen rhythms of fate. And I understand that, even in Babylon, we looked skyward before closing our eyes, because no matter the name, Marduk, Sobek, Thoth, Asclepios, men, the divine message always waited, not in the noise, but in the silence. And if you were wise enough, still enough, humble enough, the dream would come. They came with aches in their bodies, storms in their spirits, and questions clawing at their futures. To dream was their hope. In Anatolia, high in the hills and valleys of what you now call Turkey, people made pilgrimages to sacred shrines, not just to pray or offer, but to sleep, to practice what we all knew as incubation, ritual sleep, tuned to divine frequencies, with the hope of receiving a dream that could heal or guide. Their temples, while echoing the practices of Asclepios in Greece, had their own magic. Worshippers would sometimes walk labyrinthine paths before lying down, the spirals and angles believed to open their minds to sacred currents. Others would sleep beneath carvings of stars, moons, and geometric designs, trusting that sacred geometry could focus divine messages the way a lens focuses light. This wasn't sleep for rest. This was sleep as spiritual alignment. Music, incense, and chants were used to attune the soul, to vibrate the heart closer to heaven's frequency. Texts from this region speak of dream priests, spiritual guides trained not just to interpret visions, but to prepare and shape them. They would seed dreams, suggesting images, emotions, even talismans to sleep beside. You wish to dream of your child? Sleep with a fertility idol beneath your pillow. Dream of a lion. A brave son is coming. Dream of rain. A daughter, wise, gentle, and destined to grow strong. The Hittites, too, took dreams seriously, especially in royal circles. Kings and queens often received dreams not from their anxieties, but from the gods themselves. Strategic advice, healing instructions, divine mandates. One queen is even said to have received a command to adopt a foreign goddess into her shrine, a powerful example of diplomacy by dream. And while some dreamed alone, most did not. Dream incubation in Anatolia was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims formed temporary communities around sacred spaces, strangers bound by shared longing and the quiet hope that sleep would fix what waking could not. There was something beautiful in that, a collective vulnerability wrapped in silence, stretched out under the stars. Because in Anatolia, to dream was not a passive act, it was participation, a ritual offering of the self to the unknown, a surrender to mystery with the belief that the gods might answer with symbols instead of speech. And answer they did. By the time the 2nd century CE arrived, the ancient art of dream interpretation, once scattered across temples and tribes, was beginning to take shape as a formal discipline, and one man took it upon himself to catalog, decode, and define it all. Artemidoros of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor. His life's work was the Onerocritica, the most comprehensive dream manual of the ancient world. Where I carved dreams into clay, Artemidoros wrote in ink. He studied fishermen, soldiers, priests, prostitutes, every class and corner of society, because he believed that the gods spoke through every kind of life. His dream logic was layered, specific, sometimes maddeningly complex, but it was rooted in truth that dreams matter and that understanding them could mean the difference between ruin and rebirth. He didn't just record omens, he gave shape to sleep. Unlike the veiled scribes of mystery cults, Artemidorus of Daldis approached dreams like a man with ink-stained hands and a scholar's hunger. He was no temple mystic. He was an observer, part philosopher, part streetwise psychologist, and the Oneirocritica was not a scroll of cryptic symbols. It was a 5-book treatise, systematic, clear, and sprawling. He claimed to have spent decades gathering dreams from all corners of society: sailors, merchants, soldiers, prostitutes, because, in his words, if you want to understand the soul of a people, listen to their dreams. He categorized everything: actions, animals, professions, relationships, bodily functions. To fly in a dream might mean freedom or arrogance. To dream of being naked in public, for a noble, it could mean power unmasked. For a commoner, shame. Lose your teeth. Likely a relative will soon be lost too, a meaning that's survived for centuries. But where Artemidorus surpassed all before him was in his emphasis on context. Unlike earlier omen texts, which treated dreams as fixed equations, he understood that interpretation had to be tailored. Status, gender, occupation, these changed the meaning of symbols. A wealthy man dreaming of shipwreck, a financial collapse, a poor man dreaming the same, a sea change in fortune. Interpretation wasn't one size fits all. It was responsive, adaptive, prototherapy, long before we coined the term, and he embraced symbolism. To dream of death didn't mean you'd die. It might mean renewal, a dream of sex, not lust, necessarily, but power, guilt, or rivalry. His interpretations straddled the line between logic and the surreal. The Oneirocritica became a staple of the Roman and Byzantine worlds, used by dream readers, priests, scholars, translated into Arabic. It influenced the Islamic Golden Age and echoed in medieval texts long after classical temples crumbled. Artemidorus may not have believed dreams came from gods, but he knew they came from somewhere deep, and he believed they were worth exploring. But not all dreams were divine blessings. Some were terrors, dark, clawed things that rose from beneath. Nightmares were not simply bad nights, they were warnings, punishments, cosmic alarms. The Babylonians, of course, were among the first to distinguish divine visions from polluted ones. If a dream caused fear, illness, or dread, it was believed to be infected, possibly sent by evil spirits, wandering souls, or angry gods. In such cases, I would be summoned to perform apotropaic rituals, to cleanse, to seal, to protect, incense burned, amulets placed under pillows, cedar wood offered to purify the air. If someone dreamt of being chased by demons, we might place a protective figurine beneath their bed, or speak sacred words to erase the dream before it became real. The Egyptians, too, knew this dance with darkness. They wore charms of the Eye of Horus, or invoked Bes, the fierce dwarf god of protection. Some woke and immediately recited dream banishing spells. expelling the vision before it could crawl into the waking world. Even the Greeks believed certain nightmares came not from Olympus, but from below, from chthonic deities like Hades, Persephone, or the Erinyes, the Furies. Ignore these dream warnings, and you invited misfortune. Plato himself saw dreams as psychological battlegrounds between reason and chaos, soul and appetite. The Romans, ever practical, still feared the omen-heavy dreams of owls, snakes, and wolves. Such animals weren't just symbols. They were harbingers of death, betrayal, or war. And the dead? The dead could visit the living in dreams, sometimes to warn, sometimes to accuse. In every culture, nightmares weren't dismissed. They were omens, messages from the hidden, proof that even in sleep, the boundary between worlds was dangerously thin, dangerously thin. And so, we feared, and we prepared, because to dream was to risk revelation. And in the ancient world, dreams weren't only spiritual, they were political weapons. Rulers, priests, generals, all learned early. When the gods spoke in sleep, you made sure the people heard about it. Take Alexander the Great. Before he conquered Egypt, he reportedly dreamt of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. And when he reached the Siwa oasis, the oracle confirmed it. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. Now, he was divine. Whether the dream was real, invented, or whispered into legend didn't matter. The message was clear. The throne he stood on, it wasn't just political, it was celestial. Or consider Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Before his defining victory at Actium, he claimed a dream of triumph. Afterward, that vision was immortalized on coins, etched into marble, folded into poetry. A dream turned into propaganda. In times of uncertainty, dreams could justify wars, legitimize emperors, silence rivals, and those of us trained to read them. We became instruments of the state, our interpretations shaped to match what the throne required. A rebellious governor dreams of disaster. Convenient. The gods disapprove. Time to replace him. The temple elite knew the power of a well-timed vision, because when dreams speak in favor of the crown, who dares argue with heaven? In the ancient world, dreams were not merely personal experiences. They were powerful tools wielded by rulers to legitimize their authority, influence public opinion, and shape political narratives. From Egypt to Mesopotamia, dreams served as divine endorsements, often inscribed in stone to immortalize their significance. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt masterfully employed this strategy to solidify her unprecedented position as a female pharaoh. She commissioned elaborate reliefs in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, depicting her divine conception. According to these inscriptions, the god Amun assumed the form of her father, Thutmose I, to conceive her with Queen Ahmose. This narrative, supported by the gods Khnum and Heket, portrayed Hatshepsut as divinely ordained to rule, thereby reinforcing her legitimacy in a patriarchal society. In the Hebrew tradition, dreams were also pivotal. The biblical figure Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, predicting 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. This interpretation not only elevated Joseph's status, but also positioned him as a key advisor, demonstrating how dreams could influence national policy and survival strategies. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, dreams were integral to governance. King Ashurbanipal of Assyria claimed that the gods communicated with him through dreams, guiding his military campaigns and administrative decisions. These divine encounters were documented to assert his favored status and justify his actions. In Greece, dreams held both personal and political weight. Leaders like Alexander the Great reportedly experienced dreams that affirmed their divine heritage or foreshadowed their conquests. Such dreams were often publicized to bolster their authority and inspire confidence among their followers. The Romans, known for their pragmatism, also acknowledged the power of dreams. Emperor Augustus claimed to have dreamt of his future dominance, a narrative that was propagated to reinforce his destined rule. Coins and literature from his reign often referenced such dreams, intertwining personal visions with state propaganda. In all these cultures, dreams transcended the private realm, becoming instruments of power and persuasion. They were meticulously crafted narratives that linked rulers to the divine, legitimized their authority, and influenced the course of history. Through dreams, the subconscious became a stage for political theater, where the boundaries between the mortal and the divine blurred to serve the ambitions of those in power. Though the ancient temples have crumbled and the priests of dreams now lie forgotten beneath layers of time, their legacy still breathes in the modern world. The ancient art of dream interpretation continues to echo through our science, our psychology, and our imagination. Much of what we believe today about dreams, their symbols, recurring themes, and hidden meanings, can be traced back to those earliest civilizations that dared to ask, "What does sleep reveal?" The medieval world embraced this inheritance. Islamic scholars preserved and translated the Oneirocritica of Artemidorus into Arabic, refining and expanding its interpretations. In Islamic mysticism, dreams became channels for divine wisdom, carrying messages of guidance and fate. Meanwhile, Christian monks cataloged visions of saints and martyrs, dreams that predicted miracles, warnings, or divine justice. The pattern endured: sleep as a spiritual threshold, dreams as veiled messages, and dream interpreters as sacred translators. Then came the modern era. In 1899, Sigmund Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams, rejecting religious symbolism but adopting the same ancient structures: metaphor, imagery, and narrative logic. Freud saw dreams as expressions of repressed desire and unconscious thought. His protege, Carl Jung, went further, describing a dream world populated by timeless archetypes: the shadow, the hero, the wise old man. These were not far from the symbolic characters once summoned in temples from Babylon to Athens. Even today, neuroscience has joined the conversation. While stripping dreams of their mystical wrapping, science still treats them as vital windows into cognition, memory, and emotional regulation. We may no longer burn incense before bed or sleep beneath the gaze of gods, but we still chase the same mystery. Why do we dream? And what are our dreams trying to tell us? Across ages and empires, one truth endures. Humans have always looked to their dreams, not just for escape, but for meaning. The ancient world taught us that sleep could be sacred, that dreams could be destiny, and that in the quiet theater of the night, the gods, or perhaps just ourselves, are still speaking. REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the influence of trauma and memory on our dreams. Modern science continues to peel back the layers of the sleeping mind, and yet, in many ways, these ideas echo what the ancients already believed, that dreams reflect the health of the body, the turbulence of the soul, and the hidden chambers of our psyche. The old belief that dreams matter has never truly disappeared. Today, that belief lives on, not just in psychology, but in our culture, from film and literature to tarot cards and New Age spirituality. Dreams remain an enduring obsession. Horror movies explore sleep paralysis. Dream journals promise insight and healing. Apps analyze your REM cycles. We may use algorithms instead of oracles, but we're still asking the same question: what does my dream mean? The ancients didn't have EEG machines or sleep labs, but they knew something that still resonates. Dreams aren't random. They are messages, stories, symbols, warnings, whether whispered by gods, shaped by memory, or bubbling up from our subconscious. They ask us to listen, to interpret, to understand. So the question remains, timeless and haunting: what is your dream trying to tell you? Transitioning to a new historical lens. In the mid-19th century, the United States was a country expanding at breakneck speed, sprawling, restless, and stretched to its breaking point. By 1860, California had been a state for over a decade, yet it still felt less like a sibling and more like a distant cousin, isolated by deserts, mountains, and the crushing weight of distance. The East was humming with industry, railroads, and telegrams. The West, it was wild, raw, and frustratingly out of reach. Communication was a logistical nightmare. Sending a letter from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks, assuming it didn't get lost to a storm, a thief, or simple bad luck. Most mail was routed through Central America, carried by steamship down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then up the Pacific, a path riddled with disease, delay, and danger. The overland stagecoach route wasn't much better: slow, treacherous, and vulnerable to bandits, weather, and terrain that could break wheels, spirits, and bones. But this wasn't just inconvenient, it was political. California's disconnection posed a threat to national unity. If the government couldn't communicate quickly with the western frontier, it couldn't govern it. The nation needed a solution, something bold, fast, and frankly a little insane. And that's when the idea of the Pony Express was born. In the mid-19th century, the United States was rapidly expanding westward. By 1860, California had been a state for a decade, yet it often felt disconnected from the rest of the country. The eastern states were bustling with cities, telegraphs, and railroads, while the western frontier remained rugged and remote. Communication between the coasts was slow and unreliable, with letters taking weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Recognizing the need for faster communication, three ambitious businessmen, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, conceived a daring plan. They proposed a relay system of horseback riders to carry mail across the nearly 2,000-mile stretch from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. This service, known as the Pony Express, aimed to deliver mail in just 10 days, a remarkable feat for the time. The logistics were daunting. The route would traverse mountains, deserts, and territories with limited infrastructure. Stations were established every 10 to 15 miles to provide fresh horses, and riders would change every 75 to 100 miles. Despite the challenges, the first official Pony Express delivery commenced on April 3rd, 1860, with great fanfare in St. Joseph. Riders faced numerous perils, including harsh weather, difficult terrain, and the threat of attacks. Yet, the service proved effective, significantly reducing mail delivery times and strengthening the connection between the East and West. The Pony Express became a symbol of American determination and ingenuity. However, the operation was short-lived. The completion of the transcontinental telegraph in October 1861 rendered the Pony Express obsolete. Despite its brief existence, the legacy of the Pony Express endures, celebrated for its role in uniting a nation and exemplifying the spirit of the American frontier. William H. Russell saw the Pony Express as more than just a business venture. It was a chance for redemption. Facing financial scandals and a tarnished reputation, Russell hoped this audacious plan would restore his credibility and earn the favor of the federal government. If the relay system succeeded, it might land them a lucrative government mail contract and rewrite his legacy. His partner, Alexander Majors, brought the organizational brilliance. A deeply religious man with a knack for logistics, Majors ran operations with near military discipline. He was famously strict, requiring every employee, from riders to station masters, to sign a moral code that banned drinking, swearing, and gambling. His vision was precise. Relay stations would be constructed every 10 to 15 miles to swap out exhausted horses, while larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles provided rest and supplies for the riders. The system was designed like clockwork, built to survive the unforgiving terrain of the frontier. The third partner, William B. Waddell, played a quieter but no less vital role. A financial mind and legal strategist, Waddell managed the company's books and provided the operational stability to balance Russell's high-risk ambition and Major's rigid control. While less visible, his contributions kept the venture alive, at least temporarily. Together, the trio poured enormous resources into their dream. They purchased more than 400 of the fastest horses available, recruited over 80 daring young riders, some as young as 14, and constructed nearly 190 relay and home stations from Missouri to California. They employed hundreds of support staff, including station keepers, blacksmiths, and cooks, to keep the entire system moving. It was an enormous financial risk, entirely self-funded and launched without any initial backing from the U.S. government. But to them, the stakes were clear. America was growing, and whoever mastered the challenge of connecting it might carve their names permanently into the nation's story. So, on April 3rd, 1860, without fanfare from Washington or federal support, they unleashed the Pony Express onto the open plains. It was a bold move, financially reckless, logistically unthinkable, and yet deeply symbolic of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was ready to ride. The race against time, terrain, and the limits of human endurance was officially underway. Building the Pony Express route was like trying to string a fragile thread across the back of a restless continent. There was no safety net, little infrastructure, and almost zero margin for error. The full distance stretched nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. It cut through a dizzying variety of landscapes, rolling plains, jagged mountain ranges, scorching deserts, and river crossings that could become death traps in an instant. To make this audacious idea work, the founders designed a chain of around 190 relay stations, each spaced roughly 10 to 15 miles apart, the maximum distance a horse could sustain a full-speed gallop. Every 75 to 100 miles, a larger home station allowed riders to eat, sleep, and pass the mail to the next leg's courier. But the real lifeblood of the operation wasn't the wooden sod buildings. It was the horses, over 400 in total. They weren't picked for beauty or pedigree, but for raw power and relentless stamina. On the plains, nimble thoroughbreds tore across open country. In the west, sturdy mustangs muscled through rock and sand. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. The riders were trained to vault from one galloping horse to another in seconds, shaving off every precious moment from delivery time. Every station had to be manned, supplied, and fortified. Some were nothing more than lonely huts. Others resembled tiny forts, ringed by fences and watched over by armed station keepers. All had to be stocked in advance. Water, feed, spare tack, and enough food to survive the wilds. The logistics were a nightmare, and the dangers were real. Snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada could blind and bury. Sandstorms in Utah scoured skin and eyes. The Nebraska plains baked under sunstroke-inducing heat. Riders faced wild animals, swollen rivers, and crumbling trails. And those weren't the only threats. Bandits prowled the backcountry, and tensions with Native American tribes, whose lands the route crossed, added constant risk. Yet, against all odds, the system worked. Mail that once took weeks could now arrive in just 10 days. What began as an impossible gamble became a triumph of courage, coordination, and the raw need to connect a country being stretched by its own ambition, with riders switching every 75 to 100 miles and fresh horses swapped every 10 to 15. The mail raced across the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed at the time. It was a logistical marvel stitched together with grit, sweat, and sheer determination. In a land where distance often meant disconnection, the Pony Express became a lifeline, threading together the fractured geography of a growing nation, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3rd, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut in St. Joseph, Missouri. A buzzing crowd gathered outside the Pikes Peak stables, eager to witness history in motion. The inaugural rider, likely Johnny Fry, though records vary, mounted his horse, took hold of the mochila, a specially designed leather mail pouch, and bolted westward at full speed. Cannons roared, the crowd cheered, and in that moment, a new chapter of American communication thundered into life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed about 20 pounds, packed with letters, telegrams, and newspapers bound for the distant coast of California. A telegraph message from Washington, D.C. had already been sent ahead. It would now complete its journey on horseback, bridging old technology with new ambition. At the same time, a counterpart rider departed Sacramento, California, galloping east. Between them, nearly 2,000 miles of raw wilderness, 190 relay stations, and some of the most treacherous terrain on the continent. Each rider along the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a winded horse and onto a fresh mount in under 2 minutes. Ingeniously crafted, the mochila featured 4 locked pouches and slipped over the saddle horn without needing to be unstrapped. Built for speed, not ceremony, riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour through blizzards, desert, heat, pitch black nights, and hostile territory. Despite the daunting odds, the first journey was a triumph. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in just 9 days and 23 hours. Newspapers called it a miracle. The Pony Express was more than a mail service. It was a symbol of what raw courage and innovation could accomplish. Though only a handful of letters rode in that first mochila, the impact was thunderous. With riders swapping every 75 to 100 miles and fresh horses every 10 to 15, the mail soared across the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed for the era. It was a logistical marvel, woven together by courage, sweat, and sheer determination in a land where distance often equated to isolation. The Pony Express threaded a fragile line of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3rd, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut in St. Joseph, Missouri. A crowd gathered at the Pikes Peak stables, buzzing with anticipation. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, took the leather mochila, a specially designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck speed. The crowd cheered, cannons fired, and, just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. Thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed around 20 pounds, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams bound for California. A telegraph message had already been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now travel the rest of the way on horseback, symbolizing the union of technology and raw human effort. At the same moment, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the bidirectional relay. Between them stood nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the harshest terrain North America had to offer. And they planned to cross it in just 10 days. Each rider on the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a lathered horse and onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches and could be quickly slipped over the saddle horn without unstrapping anything. Speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the chaos, the first ride succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours. A triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a few letters rode in that first mochila, the symbolic impact was immense. It wasn't just about getting mail from point A to B. It was about possibility, about proving that this wild, fractured continent could be connected, that man and horse could outpace isolation. For the writers, it was the beginning of a dangerous, thrilling chapter. For the nation, it was a taste of something new, instant communication, faster than anyone thought possible. The West had just gotten a little smaller. The lifeblood of the Abra Pony Express wasn't the horses, the stations, or even the mochila. It was the riders, a band of young, wiry daredevils who defied weather, wilderness, and war to deliver the mail. They weren't just couriers, they were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18, often closer to 16. They were light, usually under 125 pounds, so as not to weigh down the horses. Speed and endurance were everything. The now famous recruitment ads allegedly read, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred." While the wording is likely apocryphal, the spirit behind it was absolutely real. These young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at every station, but never resting until they'd passed the mochila to the next rider. They often rode at night through torrential rain, snowstorms, or scorching heat. They carried revolvers and rifles, but against bandits or hostile attacks, their best defense was speed. Many of them traveled alone, unarmed, relying entirely on their ability to outrun trouble. Some riders became folk heroes. Pony Bob Haslam once rode 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver mail during a violent Paiute uprising, despite being wounded by arrows. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at age 15, though historians debate the accuracy of that tale. Regardless, the reality was already dramatic enough. Riders had to navigate the Rocky Mountains, cross the Great Basin Desert, and brave territories where the slightest mistake could mean freezing, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. And yet, the service maintained an astonishing reliability rate. Even in the harshest conditions, only one mochila was ever lost. Despite the danger, many riders loved the job. They were paid well for the time, $100 to $150 per month, a small fortune for a teenager, and they relished the thrill, the speed, and the sense of purpose. They weren't just riding mail, they were stitching the country together. The riders of the Pony Express were more than messengers. They were symbols of American courage, endurance, and tenacity, galloping through myth and memory with every hoofbeat. And for 18 unforgettable months, they proved that no frontier was too wide to cross. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just a job, it was a daily gamble with death. The riders faced a gauntlet of perils that would have made most grown men turn back. And yet, these mostly teenage boys pressed forward through nature's wrath, armed enemies, and a land that often seemed determined to swallow them whole. One of the most persistent threats came from the environment itself. Riders braved blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, blistering heat across the Nevada desert, and sudden thunderstorms that could flood river crossings or turn dirt paths into impassable muck. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions could mean hypothermia, One wrong move in a swollen river could end in drowning, and many came dangerously close. Then there were the animals. Packs of wolves sometimes chased riders through the blackened plains, their howls echoing across the night. Rattlesnakes, nearly invisible in the dusty brush, lay coiled in wait along narrow trails. In the high passes of the Rockies, mountain lions silently stalked from the shadows. But even more dangerous than the wild was the human threat. Bandits and bushwhackers knew that a rider's mochila carried more than just news. It often held letters laced with gold dust, military orders, or money drafts worth risking a life to steal. Though the riders carried Colt revolvers, they were often alone and outnumbered. Their only real defense was speed. Stopping meant risking not only the delivery, but their life. And they didn't stop. Tensions with Native American tribes also escalated during the brief life of the Pony Express. The Paiute War of 1860, ignited by long-standing grievances over land theft, broken treaties, and settler aggression, erupted into violence across parts of the express route. Several Pony Express stations were attacked. Station keepers were killed, and multiple outposts were burned to ash. One of the most legendary episodes from this conflict came when Pony Bob Haslam galloped nearly 190 miles through war-torn Nevada, wounded by arrows but refusing to quit. He rode through hostile territory to deliver the mail, ensuring that no message, however small, would go undelivered. Even when there were no attacks or predators, riders faced a more invisible but deadly threat: solitude. They rode alone for hours, sometimes days, through barren landscapes, with nothing but their horse, their firearm, and the ever-thickening silence. A broken limb, an injured mount, or missing a station by mere miles could mean death by exposure, starvation, or injury. Alone, without help, and often without a trace. And yet, they rode. Despite every obstacle, the Pony Express endured. Deliveries were sometimes delayed, but rarely lost. Riders were wounded, but almost always finished their route. In 18 months of continuous operation, only a handful of men were killed on duty. This was not the romantic fantasy of dime novels. It was a brutal, grueling enterprise, forged in sweat and courage. And in surviving these dangers, the Pony Express riders didn't just become employees of a mail service. They became icons, proof that the American frontier could be bridged, if only long enough to hand over the mail. Though the Pony Express lasted just 18 months, its impact on the United States was immediate, far-reaching, and deeply symbolic. In a country inching toward civil war, desperate for any thread of connection across its sprawling geography, the Express proved something that echoed louder than gunfire. Distance was no longer destiny. Before the Pony Express, it took weeks, sometimes over a month, for mail to travel from the East Coast to California. By the time letters arrived, the news they carried was often obsolete. Political decisions, commercial deals, even family tragedies reached their recipients long after they mattered. But the Pony Express changed that. With delivery times slashed to 10 days, San Francisco was no longer a distant, drifting outpost. It became a real-time player in the affairs of the Union. Business owners could trade faster, Newspapers reported fresher news. Government orders arrived with urgency intact. For the first time, Americans could feel like one nation, stretched from sea to shining sea, and connected not by rail or telegraph yet, but by horse, grit, and an iron will to overcome the divide. Newspapers could now report near real-time updates from across the nation. Families felt closer, and most importantly, the Union felt more united, an emotional and political lifeline as the Civil War loomed on the horizon. The Pony Express wasn't just about mail, it was about holding the Asa country together during its most fragile hour. Politically, the Express sent a powerful message to the federal government. The West was within reach. It stood as a living symbol of national strength and cohesion at a time when the country teetered on the edge of fragmentation. President James Buchanan received regular dispatches from California during the tense months leading up to Abraham Lincoln's election. The Express helped calm fears that California and other far-flung territories might drift from the Union's grasp. Economically, it laid the foundation for future infrastructure. The relay stations constructed across vast and hostile landscapes were not temporary outposts. They became future waypoints for the Transcontinental Railroad, telegraph lines, and overland stage routes. What began as a daring experiment quickly became the blueprint for connecting America from ocean to ocean. And culturally, the Pony Express transformed into legend in real time. Newspapers romanticized the young riders, painting them as fearless cowboys racing across the wilderness with messages that could shape the fate of a nation. Young men across the country dreamed of saddling up, risking it all for a cause bigger than themselves. The Express became myth before it even ended, embodying the raw courage and unity that Americans longed for. Even after it shuttered, its spirit lived on, shaping the identity of a rapidly changing nation. It represented not just speed, but hope, not just mail, but destiny. In just over a year, it succeeded where steamships, legislation, and diplomacy had failed. It made a fractured country feel like one. But for all its grit and glory, the Pony Express was doomed from the beginning, not by failure, but by the march of progress. As swift as a galloping horse could be, it was no match for the spark of electricity. Just 2 days after the first official Pony Express ride, in April 1860, construction began on the Transcontinental Telegraph, a coast-to-coast wire network capable of transmitting messages not in days, but in minutes. Telegraph lines stretched steadily westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California, pole by pole, wire by wire. Every mile of cable strung was another nail in the coffin of the Pony Express. By October 24th, 1861, just 18 months after that first dramatic ride, the final wire was connected. The Transcontinental Telegraph was complete. Messages could now leap from coast to coast in an instant, making the heroic rides of the Express suddenly obsolete. That very same day, the telegraph wires completed their coast-to-coast connection. The Pony Express delivered its final letter. The rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats faded, replaced by the click and clatter of Morse code. The era of the electric message had begun. But even before the telegraph, The Pony Express was already bleeding cash. Despite its legendary speed and service, it was a financial disaster. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had invested over $700,000, a staggering amount at the time, into the venture, but barely made back a fraction of it. With no federal subsidy and sky-high operational costs, feeding horses, maintaining remote stations, and paying daring young riders, the Express was never a viable business. It was always a proof of concept, a bold attempt to win a government mail contract that never fully materialized. Russell faced financial scandal. The company began to crumble. By the time the telegraph was completed, the Pony Express wasn't just obsolete, it was already dying. And yet, its end came without bitterness, because, in its short life, the Pony Express had accomplished its goal. It had shown, beyond any doubt, that rapid coast-to-coast communication was possible. Riders moved on to other frontier roles. Stations were abandoned or repurposed. The nation looked forward to wires and railroads and new technologies that would shrink the country even further. But the fall of the Pony Express wasn't a failure. It was a handoff, from hooves to electricity, from leather mochilas to buzzing telegraph keys. It was the passing of the torch in America's great race toward connection. For one glorious, high-speed moment, teenage boys and powerful horses defeated geography. They outran doubt. They stitched together sprawling, fragmented land, and in doing so, they galloped straight into legend. Though it lasted only 18 months, the Pony Express became one of the most enduring and romanticized icons of the American West. In reality, it was a short-lived, high-risk business, but in the public imagination, it became something more, a story of courage, speed, and the relentless drive to connect. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks elevated the Express into myth. The image of a lone rider silhouetted against the setting sun, leather pouch slung across his shoulder, galloping across an endless prairie. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a story America told itself about who it was and who it wanted to be. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became household names, frontier celebrities, symbols of grit and glory. And even as satellites now carry our messages in milliseconds, we still look back in awe at the Pony Express, because it wasn't just about delivering mail, it was about delivering hope, about proving that no distance was too far, no challenge too great, and that in the heart of the American wilderness, speed, spirit, and sacrifice could write history, one gallop at a time. Cody, whether he truly rode for the Pony Express or simply embraced the myth, knew the power of the story. Through his Wild West shows, he brought the legend to life for millions, both in America and abroad, turning the image of the fearless teenage courier into a global icon. The Pony Express became a symbol of grit, daring, and the boundless ambition Americans like to believe defined their pioneer past. And so, the monuments came. Statues of galloping riders now stand proudly in cities along the old trail. From St. Joseph to Sacramento, highways and bike paths follow the original route. Reenactments bring the past to life, and museum exhibits immerse visitors in the story of a nation on the move. The U.S. Postal Service has even issued commemorative stamps, paying tribute to the bold experiment that helped knit the country together. But the reason the Pony Express continues to capture imaginations isn't just about speed or romance. It endures because it represents a moment, brief but unforgettable, when human determination dared to challenge nature itself. A moment when teenage boys on horseback outran isolation, when every mile was a risk and every hoofbeat echoed with purpose. The Pony Express didn't just carry mail, it carried a message that even the most impossible dreams can be realized if you ride fast enough. When communication meant risk and connection demanded courage, speed didn't come from satellites. It came from sheer willpower and a determination to brave snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In today's world of instant messages and global connectivity, it's easy to forget how hard-won communication once was. The Pony Express stands as a tribute to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics, but with grit, muscle, and pounding heartbeats. Its legend doesn't endure because it lasted long. It endures because, for a brief and brilliant moment, it outran the impossible. And speaking of legacies, let's rewind even further to the very first beer ever brewed. The earliest known beer didn't come in a frosty mug or a labeled bottle. It came in a clay pot, bubbling in the middle of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago. Long before Rome rose or the pyramids stood tall, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways that were both simple and sacred. And they weren't just drinking it, they were venerating it. Beer in Sumerian society wasn't just a beverage, it was food, currency, religion, and a mark of civilization. It's no coincidence that the oldest known written recipe in human history isn't for bread or stew, but for beer. Inscribed on clay tablets from around 1800 BCE, the Hymn to Ninkasi not only praises the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, but also doubles as a set of brewing instructions. She wasn't some fringe deity either. She was honored and revered. Brewing beer was, quite literally, an act of devotion. The process was both poetic and practical. The Sumerians would bake a barley-based bread called bapir, sometimes mixed with honey or dates, crumble it into jars of water, and allow it to ferment. Naturally, the result wasn't anything like modern lager. It was thick, cloudy, mildly alcoholic, a kind of nutritious, soupy brew, but it was essential to everyday life. Unlike water, which was often unsafe to drink, beer was purified through fermentation. It was calorie-dense, nutrient-rich, and part of nearly every meal, especially for laborers and temple workers. In fact, beer was so central to the economy that it often served as payment. Workers digging canals, building temples, or maintaining irrigation systems were frequently compensated with daily beer rations, sometimes up to several liters a day. For the Sumerians, beer wasn't just sustenance, it was survival, worship, and a unifying force of society, brewed with reverence and consumed with purpose. Socially, beer was more than just a beverage. It was a ritual, a bond, a daily affirmation of life. In ancient Sumerian society, people didn't sip from mugs at a bar. They gathered in circles around large ceramic jars, drinking together through long reed straws that filtered out the thick sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about connection to each other, to survival, to the divine. Beer was embedded in every facet of Sumerian life: their agriculture, law codes, religious ceremonies, and even their economy. It was liquid civilization, a sacred sustenance that both sustained bodies and honored gods. And that sacredness didn't stop at Sumer. It flowed down the Tigris, across the Fertile Crescent, and into the land of the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual beginnings, the ancient Egyptians industrialized it. By the time of Egypt's Old Kingdom, beer had become more than a holy drink. It was a cornerstone of society. It was part of daily meals, sacred offerings, and even burial rites. Temples and royal complexes hosted massive breweries, turning beer into a state-run industry. The brewing process, while rooted in Sumerian methods, had evolved in both scale and sophistication. Partially baked loaves made from emmer wheat or barley were crumbled into vats, mixed with water and sweetened with dates or honey. The mixture fermented inside large ceramic jars into a thick, hearty brew, often so dense it was eaten with a spoon. And beer wasn't just for the living. Tombs were stocked with jars of it, carefully placed alongside bread and meat to nourish the dead in the afterlife. Murals, painted on limestone walls, showed brewing scenes step by step, and written offerings included meticulous beer counts for rituals. To the Egyptians, beer was a divine provision. It was believed to be a gift from Osiris, god of agriculture and life, and it featured in ceremonies honoring Hathor, the goddess of music, joy, fertility, and intoxication. Beer, in this context, was both spiritual ecstasy and sustenance. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of beer's reach was in its role in labor. Contrary to popular myth, the builders of the pyramids were not slaves. They were skilled laborers, and their wages often came in liquid form. Some workers received rations of beer, up to 4 liters a day. It wasn't indulgence, it was hydration, nutrition, and morale. One archaeologist aptly dubbed it the original energy drink. And the Egyptians didn't leave beer to chance. The state tightly controlled its production and distribution. Beer wasn't just sacred, it was strategic, a tool for maintaining loyalty, fueling workers, and structuring society. From the golden walls of temples to the dusty hands of pyramid builders, beer was the drink that built a civilization. In ancient Egypt, beer was more than nourishment. It was a regulated commodity, sacred tradition, and a societal cornerstone. Taxes were collected in beer, and its quality wasn't left to chance. The state imposed standards, ensuring that this vital resource met both practical and ceremonial needs. Women, particularly priestesses and temple workers, played a central role in brewing. Their involvement linked beer to both domestic authority and divine purpose, elevating it beyond the role of a common drink. It was, quite literally, a matter of life, livelihood, and legacy. Beer in Egypt wasn't a footnote in history, it was the ink itself. It nourished the masses, satisfied the gods, and lined the tombs of kings. Like the Nile, it flowed through every channel of Egyptian life: economic, spiritual, and cultural. Across the ancient world, beer was never just consumed, it was revered. To drink it was to commune with the divine. Its fermentation wasn't merely chemistry, it was alchemy, transformation blessed by the gods themselves. Grain became spirit, liquid became sacred. In Sumer, this connection was personified by the goddess Ninkasi, the divine brewer. Her hymn was both worship and recipe, a sacred chant detailing the brewing process. To invoke her was to sanctify the beer-making ritual. Brewing began with song, with reverence, with the intention of creating not just a beverage, but a blessing. The finished beer may have been sipped by workers, but it was also poured in libation to the gods, shared with priests, and offered at altars. In Egypt, the spiritual role of beer went even deeper. It wasn't just part of temple life, it was temple life. It was offered during festivals, presented to the gods as part of ritual feasts, and included in prayers for fertility, prosperity, and safe passage to the afterlife. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was a bridge between people and deities, between survival and sanctity, between the ordinary and the eternal. Temples across ancient Egypt didn't just consume beer, they produced it. Dedicated breweries operated within temple complexes, supplying hundreds of jars for daily rituals. Beer wasn't an occasional offering, it was a spiritual staple. During festivals, its presence was overwhelming. One of the most striking examples was the annual festival of drunkenness, a celebration rooted in myth and divine mercy. Worshippers reenacted the story of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of wrath, who was poised to annihilate humanity until the gods tricked her into drinking beer, dyed red to mimic blood. Drunk and pacified, her rage subsided, and the world was spared. It wasn't just a story, it was a cosmic parable of beer's power to transform destruction into peace, chaos into order. Priests and priestesses didn't merely serve beer, they crafted it. Ritual brews were described in sacred texts with ingredients, processes, and purposes tailored for different ceremonies. In funerary rites, beer held a crucial role. It wasn't simply a send-off gift, it was spiritual sustenance. Inscriptions on tombs listed specific beer offerings alongside hymns and prayers, believed to nourish the soul on its journey through the afterlife. Without beer, the road to eternity was incomplete. Beyond the temple walls, beer flowed freely during seasonal festivals that merged joy with devotion. These gatherings weren't casual feasts, they were sacred acts, communal rites where humans connected with gods through shared libation. Whether honoring the dead, celebrating a good harvest, or marking a celestial event, beer helped dissolve the barrier between the earthly and the divine. It was, in every sip, a drink of unity. Even in neighboring cultures, like the Hebrews and Hittites, beer retained its spiritual gravity. Though wine grew dominant in elite circles, beer remained a powerful symbol of fertility, earthbound wisdom, and the sacred roots of the common people. It stayed grounded, sacred, and connected to the rhythms of soil, season, and survival. In the ancient world, drinking beer was never just about quenching thirst. It was about aligning yourself with the universe, with nature, the divine, and the eternal dance of life and death. Beer wasn't merely a byproduct of civilization, it was its spark, its symbol, and perhaps its origin story. Some historians and archaeologists now propose a radical but increasingly supported idea. The drive to brew beer may have been one of the key motivations behind the dawn of agriculture. While it's long been assumed that humans first domesticated grain to make bread, there's growing evidence that our ancestors may have been just as interested, if not more, in brewing beer. If that's true, beer isn't just a cultural byproduct of civilization, it's one of its foundations. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, barley became one of the first domesticated crops. While it was indeed ground into flour and baked into bread, archaeological findings suggest that barley's fermentable sugars were equally valued for making beer. In a world where clean drinking water was scarce and unreliable, beer offered a safe, storable, and nutrient-rich alternative. It didn't just hydrate, it sustained, it preserved, it built communities. But making beer wasn't simple. Brewing required deliberate planning, storing grain, crafting vessels for fermentation, monitoring temperatures, and timing each stage correctly. This pushed early societies toward more sophisticated tools, better construction techniques, and collaborative labor. In short, it demanded infrastructure. The brewing process encouraged innovation, the development of early chemistry, and the beginnings of food science, and it spurred social structure. Not everyone in a settlement could brew beer at the same time. Some grew the grain, others baked the bread. A few managed the fermentation. This division of labor, sparked in part by a thirst for beer, helped shape early economies and hierarchies. The village brewer wasn't just making a beverage, they were anchoring the community. Beer didn't just accompany civilization, it may have helped invent it. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia reveal something remarkable. Brewers of the time had a deep, intuitive understanding of fermentation. They couldn't measure temperature or isolate yeast strains like we can today, but they could consistently reproduce complex brewing techniques, a scientific achievement in an era without tools. In cities like Uruk and Babylon, beer wasn't a household novelty, it was institutional. Breweries became critical components of temple and state economies. Beer rations were regularly distributed to laborers, soldiers, and civil servants. Government officials tracked those rations with meticulous records, often etched into clay. Taxes could be collected not only in grain, but in beer itself. And because brewing was so economically and spiritually important, it was tightly regulated. This regulation sparked advancements in bureaucracy, early accounting systems, and the development of standardized weights and measures, all foundational to organized society. In ancient Egypt, this tradition endured. Women routinely brewed beer in clay pots using partially baked loaves of emmer grain, mixed with water and natural sweeteners like dates or honey. It was laborious but commonplace. For many, brewing was a daily or weekly task, not just to feed their households, but to barter or sell in the marketplace. In wealthier homes, female servants or workers ran the show, managing small-scale breweries with efficiency and expertise. This wasn't invisible. Labor, tomb paintings, temple inscriptions, and archaeological evidence consistently show women brewing, filtering, and storing beer. Their presence was everywhere the brew was made, from humble kitchens to the most sacred sanctuaries. Priestesses and temple staff, often women, brewed beer as offerings to the gods, cementing its role in both divine service and daily life. In some regions, being a brewer granted women status and influence. They weren't just homemakers, they were artisans of fermentation and custodians of cultural memory, carrying on traditions that nourished bodies, honored gods, and built civilizations. As civilizations evolved and power structures solidified, the brewing pot slowly passed from women's hands into the public, commercial sphere dominated by men. But in the earliest, most foundational chapters of beer's story, it was women who held the reins. They crafted the techniques, managed the ingredients, and preserved the brewing wisdom that would echo through millennia. Surprisingly, remnants of this female-led tradition endured well into the medieval period. In Europe, many early brewers were alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes. Some even wore tall hats in markets so they could be easily spotted, a visual detail that centuries later morphed into the pointed hat associated with witches. But in the ancient world, a woman with a bubbling brew pot wasn't suspicious. She was revered. She nourished both gods and mortals, one sacred jar at a time. Ancient brewing wasn't just a matter of chance or mysticism, it was a honed craft, refined through generations of trial, error, and environmental insight. While the ingredients and rituals varied by region, the core elements of beer were surprisingly universal: grain, water, fermentation, and time. Barley was the cornerstone across much of the ancient world, prized for its fermentable sugars and natural enzymes. Emmer wheat, particularly popular in Egypt, also featured heavily in brewing. These grains were often partially malted, soaked, and allowed to sprout slightly before being ground into mash or baked into a special bread. In Mesopotamia, these loaves were known as bapir, and they formed the base of the beer. To brew, these bread loaves were crumbled into large ceramic vats filled with water. The mixture was stirred, sometimes gently boiled, and left to ferment. No one knew the science of yeast, but brewers understood that certain jars consistently produced better beer. They likely housed microbial colonies that kick-started fermentation. The beer's flavor was often enhanced with natural sweeteners, like dates, honey, or herbs. Egyptian beer was especially dense and sweet, more akin to a hearty porridge than a bubbly beverage. Filtering was optional. Sometimes it was sipped through long reeds to avoid sediment. Other times, it was scooped with spoons. For the working class, this wasn't just a drink, it was nourishment, a meal in liquid form. Temperature played a critical role in ancient brewing. In hot climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia, brewers timed their work carefully and relied on cool storage pits or shaded courtyards to control the brewing environment. Some batches were aged in sealed clay jars for preservation, while others were intended to be consumed fresh. Brewing tools were simple, yet effective. Large clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and sometimes stone hearths for gentle heating. Every part of the process was done by hand, and no two batches were exactly alike. Still, knowledge was meticulously preserved, passed down orally through generations via ritual, repetition, and even song. Most famously, the hymn to Ninkasi. Far from primitive, these brewing techniques were finely tuned to the surrounding environment, local grains, and cultural taste. They reflected not only culinary expertise, but also an intimate relationship with time, nature, and transformation. An early form of alchemy where humble grain and water became a sacred social elixir. As beer became central to daily life, its role expanded well beyond the household or temple. In many ancient civilizations, beer was more than a beverage. It was currency, a commodity, and an economic engine. From wages to taxation, beer was deeply woven into the fabric of commerce. In Mesopotamia, for instance, beer formed a crucial part of the ration system. Builders, farmers, and even scribes received daily beer allocations as part of their pay. The quality and quantity of beer distributed varied by status. Officials received more refined brews, while laborers were given thicker, more filling varieties. This wasn't anecdotal, it's documented. Cuneiform tablets detail these allocations, and thousands of ancient receipts record beer transactions. Together, they prove that beer stood alongside silver and grain as one of the cornerstones of the ancient economic ecosystem. Beer production evolved into a full-scale professional industry in the ancient world. Breweries, often connected to temples or large estates, employed a network of laborers, grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Some regions became renowned for their beer styles, giving rise to local specialties and establishing trade routes to distribute them. Though these ancient beers weren't bottled like today's brews, they were transported in ceramic jars, sealed with wax or cloth. Traders exchanged beer for essentials like wool, pottery, and olive oil. In Egypt, the system mirrored this scale. Beer was brewed in vast quantities, both in cities and rural estates. Many breweries were linked to state granaries, and their output was used to sustain workers, supply soldiers, and support temple functions. Beer wasn't just a commodity, it was a strategic resource. It was taxed, tracked, and stockpiled. During economic hardship, beer often substituted for currency in bartering systems. It even played a role in long-distance trade. Archaeologists have found beer residues in clay vessels stretching from the Levant to Cyprus to Nubia, evidence that fermented beverages moved through the same networks as luxury goods. While wine would later dominate elite circles, beer remained the drink of the masses, accessible, essential, and embedded in everyday life. From local markets to state-led temple distributions, beer served as both a social staple and an economic driver. Its perishability made it largely local, but its significance was national. Beer production supported a complex ecosystem of farmers, artisans, traders, and priests. It was not only a source of daily nutrition, it was infrastructure. Beer built pyramids, fueled economies, supported armies, and underpinned empires. In essence, Ancient beer wasn't just drunk, it was counted, traded, stored, and spent. It was civilization in a jar. A mug of beer may have cost only a few copper coins, but behind that humble vessel stood an entire microcosm of civilization in the ancient world. Beer was the great equalizer, consumed by virtually all, yet far from equal in quality or meaning. While commoners drank thick, porridge like brews for survival, the elite turned beer into a status symbol, a ritual artifact, and even a political instrument. Among the Sumerians and Akkadians, beer was a central part of daily life and labor. Workers received daily beer rations that were dark, unfiltered, and dense, more nourishing stew than drink. These were functional beers designed to sustain laborers under the scorching sun. But even within these rations, a hierarchy existed. Cuneiform tablets describe at least 9 distinct types of beer, each ranked by quality and purpose. Higher status, individuals like priests, scribes, and administrators received better brews, reflecting and reinforcing societal stratification. In Egypt, the contrast was even more pronounced. The working class consumed beer brewed from emmer wheat and sweetened with dates, a thick, sometimes spooned out concoction that functioned more like soup than beverage. Meanwhile, the elite sipped lighter, sweeter, and often filtered brews. Tomb paintings depict nobles lounging under palm fronds, golden beer goblets in hand, attended by servants pouring from ornate jars. For the wealthy, beer was more than sustenance. It was a sensory and social luxury. Pharaohs and their families received daily offerings of beer, served alongside bread and wine. These libations were both symbolic and political, reflections of power, divinity, and control over resources. Hosting a feast without high-quality beer was a diplomatic faux pas. To serve inferior beer, or none at all, was to insult one's guests and diminish one's own status. The brewing profession mirrored these divides. In rural homes and small villages, women and slaves brewed beer for daily consumption. In temples and royal households, however, brewing became professionalized. Skilled brewers, sometimes salaried and trained, managed complex operations. Their output was closely monitored, taxed, and regulated. Temple vats didn't just produce beer, they produced influence. Despite its universality, beer tasted and signified very differently, depending on one's place in the social pyramid. For the majority, it was daily fuel. For the privileged, it was a marker of class and ceremony. Each jar of ancient beer carried not only flavor, but a subtle imprint of social order, its frothy rim tinged with the signature of status. And yet, the story of beer is not just one of social division, but also enduring legacy. Thousands of years after Sumerian priestesses invoked Ninkasi, or Egyptian builders drank beneath pyramid shadows, the echoes of their brews persist. Beer still connects us through our recipes, our festivals, our rituals, and our memories. Modern brewing owes much to this ancient wisdom. The techniques we rely on today, malting, fermenting with natural yeast, sweetening with herbs or fruits, were honed by generations of ancient brewers who had no microscopes or thermometers. Instead, They trusted tradition, refined through observation, oral knowledge, and ritual. These methods laid the groundwork for scientific brewing centuries later. The cultural spirit of beer endures. In places like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe, communities continue to brew beer in clay vessels using ancient techniques passed down through generations. Brewing remains a communal ritual, an act of memory and identity, just as it was 5,000 years ago. Even today, beer is central to social rituals, from Oktoberfest to family barbecues to a pint shared with friends at the local pub. In these moments, we aren't just drinking, we're participating in a legacy that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization. Bioarchaeology and experimental archaeology have brought this history to life. Through residue analysis and ancient recipes, scientists have recreated and commercially brewed beers from ancient tombs. With every sip, modern drinkers get a taste of history, of barley fields tilled by hand, of clay pots buried in temple grounds, of a civilization that found unity in the fermentation of grain. Above all, the story of beer reminds us that civilization was not just built by conquest or monuments. It was built by ordinary people, by women who brewed, by workers who drank, and by communities that gathered to share in something deeply human. So the next time you raise a glass, remember, you're not just drinking, you're taking part in one of humanity's oldest, most sacred rituals, a legacy brewed over millennia, still fermenting in every corner of the world. So yeah, your beer? It's not just a drink, it's ancient power juice, the fuel of pyramid builders, the original hydration station. It was wages, worship, and wild parties, all in a jug. And those ancient brewers? Mostly badass women mixing science with sorcery before it was cool. So next time someone says, beer is just for game night, hit 'em with 5,000 years of history. Beer built civilization. Period. Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, maybe you need another round. Smash that like, slap the subscribe, and drop your favorite weird beer fact in the comments. We've got more ancient madness coming your way. Cheers to the OG brewers.